I've quipped that I think understanding the different kinds of AI models is going to be key for IT services providers to understand in order to be relevant. Do you know about data-driven generative AI? Steve Wasick joins me to explain that and learn a little bit more on this bonus episode of The Business of Tech. You're thinking about security for your customers and want to step up to virtual CISO services. Sonomi has a guide for you. Learn what SMBs are looking for, how to add virtual CISO services at scale to your managed services portfolio without adding headcount, and how to do so in a profitable manner. Download the guide to learn how you can leverage Sonomi to set up virtual CISO services by visiting sonomi.com/resources. That's CYNOMI.com. Virtual CISO at scale. Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave.
So I've been exploring all of the various uses that we might apply generative AI to. And when I was looking, you've got one area that kind of I wanted to understand a little bit more why it was an obvious use case. You've started, one of the areas you're working on is generated sports articles in real time. Help me understand why that's a really good use case.
Well, I think in general, generative AI works better with scale, right? So anytime, if you're just doing a quarterly report or something like that, it's very unlikely that you're going to reach out for generative AI to help you out because it's just such a small use case, right? Well, with sports, sure, like covering the Super Bowl is not necessarily something that you'd need generative AI for, but what about, a Tuesday night game between two, ACC basketball teams, maybe that's not of interest enough for an organization such as CBS Sports, which we work with, to assign a reporter just to cover that game. And that's just for one type of content, right? You might have a recap, but what about previewing the game? What about looking at it from a gambling perspective? What about looking at it from a fantasy perspective, right? There's lots of different angles that you could look at an individual game at. And so that just multiplies the amount of content that you'd have to produce. So scale is the big reason I think that sports is very amenable to generative AI. The other thing that's helpful is timeliness, right? So you're trying to get your reports out, as soon as possible. And as the data comes in, right, you want to be the first to publish. If the betting lines are changing, you want to be able to change your article to reflect that. Like all these things that change, that's another reason why you might need to produce new content. And again, that's just adding to the scale factor. And so you having something that's automated, that's not relying on an individual having to recraft the story, becomes much more valuable.
Now, one of the things that, obviously the headlines we keep hearing about is the idea that AI hallucinates and that it gets things wrong. But when I talk to those working in the space, while they acknowledge that, they actually are giving me some sort of indication that summarization is one of those tools that it's quite good at, and that happens a lot less. Give me a little bit of insight as somebody who's doing it at scale, how you're balancing that hallucination risk with accuracy and speed.
So we balance it by not using the same technology that current LLMs are using. So like ChatGPT, all that, they use what's called like a large language model, which, just to give a quick oversight, is sort of a probabilistic method, right? And so that's why you get these hallucinations, is because there's not necessarily a straight line that you can draw as the engineer to say, oh, here's exactly how it got its answer, and if it's going wrong, here's how we correct it. That's not really possible with LLMs. What we use is a technology which we call conceptual automata, which I won't go into like the super details about, but it's basically breaking down the stories into their smallest subcomponents and then allowing the system to build them back up using all these individual subcomponents. And because of that, we can debug it to know exactly how it wrote. Like anything that gets written up by our system, we can trace exactly what happened. And if there's a problem with it, then we can fix it. And so that's really helpful for our clients because we never have to worry about the hallucinations. And, when you're talking about summary, that's great. And I believe you're accurate that that's something where it's much less likely to hallucinate. But when it comes to sports or financial data or the other things that we do, you can't really summarize it because the idea is to build this thing up from scratch, right? Like this information just came in, right? And so you have to build the initial report on that topic. It's not about summarizing what everybody else wrote. And so that, if you were to use an LLM for writing about sports or finance or these other things, there's several problems that would happen, but definitely the hallucination thing I think would come into play more because it is a brand new piece of content that you're writing about.
Okay, this is really useful insight because one of the things that I've talked about a lot on the show is that I think the IT services organizations need to become experts in understanding the different kinds of models and how they apply, so that even if they're not building in it, they can advise their customers
Yeah.
on which products are relevant. So that understanding that is super important. How do you convey that as part of the process to customers that are talking to you? Is that part of your marketing material? Is that something that you talk about in consulting? How do you help them understand that?
Yeah, I think it's just a process because, like you said, it's pretty new to everybody, and people are trying to understand all the different models and the different use cases. And so, what we call our technology is data generative AI, as opposed to most generative AI, which sort of starts with text and ends with text. We start with data and then end with text, and also charts, visualizations. We could do a lot of different things, but it's definitely a different methodology and something that we need to just kind of on a case by case basis talk to people about because for whatever reason, what we're doing is not super well known. There's just not a lot of people in the same space. Whereas the ChatGPT stuff, of course, it's wildly, yeah, everybody is doing it. There's a million companies trying to take advantage of it or do their own version of it. Whereas the idea of starting with data is still somewhat unknown. So it is just kind of something where we have to walk people through the advantages. There's some disadvantages too, but I think that the advantages are pretty clear if you have a really big data set that needs analysis and synthesis.
Okay. Now, talk me through the process of kind of integrating this automated content into a company's workflow, because it feels like this is an area that could be super error prone, and mistakes could be really devastating if you do
Yes.
it wrong. Kind of walk me through that process.
Yeah, what we do is it's basically a three-part process. So the first part is ingesting the data, right? Which is tends to be complicated, right? Because people have a lot of different data silos. Now that's fine in terms of our system can really easily pull down, information from a bunch of different places, but we still have to know, sort of where to point that. What's the structure of the data? Is there any missing data, things like that, bad data, all the types of basic things you'd have to do for a data analysis in terms of cleaning things up. We have to do that as well. So that's sort of the first step. The second step is we model and generate content, right? That's like the main thing that we do, right? Is put this data into a conceptual hierarchy and understand, what do you want the output to look like? Do you want it to be a paragraph, 5 paragraphs? What are the most important things, to the people who are reading this? Like, do you have any jargon or any sort of like tone, all these different things with the writing itself? Do you want visualizations? All these different things are sort of the main thing that we do. And then the last thing is, where do you want this to be distributed, right? Is this internal? Do you want this to be a website? One of the great things about automated content is that it's pretty easy to set up into different formats, right? The hard part is actually creating the content itself. And then once you have that, it's usually pretty easy to say like, oh, okay, this is going to be part of an RSS, or this is going to be emailed, or this is going to be, put into a box in your system for you to work with, or this is going to be a website, whatever it is, it's like that part is actually pretty easy and can be all those things, right? Like it's not like you have to choose one, right? That's again another great part of automated content. It's very easy to segment it once you've built it to say like, oh, here is the RSS and here's the email version and here's the website version, right? It's like the system once it's set up can very easily scale to a lot of different distribution points.
Now, one of the things that we've seen, particularly when we see broadly kind of the generative AI space, which I'm going to acknowledge you're focused on a
Yeah.
subsection and you're much more specialized. But one of the big things that we see in a lot of the content that's out there is that oftentimes it's slightly awkwardly written. You
Hmm.
can kind of tell. And by the way, I expect this is going to get better and better over time. But one of the things that we're having is that it is kind of awkward or difficult. And one of the pieces that we're generally recommending is that humans get involved, but it feels at this scale that's not how that works. How are you addressing kind of the thinking on making it readable, making it make sense, making it seem natural, when at the same time pushing for that level of scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, it kind of goes back to this idea of traceability, where everything that we write, we can see exactly how it created that information. And so if something doesn't read right, we can typically fix it, right? Or the other thing I think that happens with LLM stuff is it tends to just come across as really generic, right? It doesn't have a lot of pop. I mean, we do finance stuff, we do medical stuff. Maybe you don't care as much about having like that impact about when you're doing a quarterly report, although it still matters there, I think too, but it definitely matters in something like sports, right? And it certainly matters, I think, if you're doing a regular report, right? Like this is something we do in finance, where it's like, okay, here's the corn report, like which we do for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, but it's like it's an email series. So like the person reading that also read the report yesterday and the day before and the day before that. So you really got to take that into account as well, right? So there's a lot of factors in really making language sing, right, and make it actually interesting, and we can put those into our system. And I think that that's a big differentiator between other companies in the data generative AI space, which take what I call more like a Mad Libs approach, which is different than the LLM problem. In this case, it's more just like it's always the same stuff, right? And that doesn't really appeal to people, because the problem is, usually the things that are most interesting are the unique aspects of the data. Well, if you're building a template, you got to build for the things that happen all the time. So it's basically you're building something that's always going to talk about the most boring aspects of the data, right? If you're using a templated approach. So that's another way that that generative AI can sort of leave a reader with the impact that you're talking about, which is just kind of like, this doesn't quite work, right? And so we think that our technology is able to sort of navigate both of those issues, where you have the LLM stuff kind of creating this sort of weird generic content. You have the templated stuff on the other end that's just like the same thing every time. And then, we think we can kind of have the best of both worlds.
So give me a sense of areas that are bad uses of this kind of technology. And I find that because anybody, I quip all the time. If anybody says it does everything, oftentimes it doesn't do anything well, right? No. And so it's better to find those really good use cases that it's really good at. But to counter that, we want to know the ones that it's not good at, so that we can exclude. What are you finding are the ones that are just not good matches?
That's a great question. And for our particular technology, the key things that we need are scale, I think, and that's one of the things that, I'll say two things: scale and complexity of output. The scale part's pretty easy, right? Like if you have a quarterly report, it doesn't make sense for us to go through, ingest your data, model it, and do all this stuff just to produce 4 reports every year, right? Because the money, you're not going to be able to pay us what it costs us to set up to do that. So you need a lot of scale. The complexity piece is a little bit more complicated, and that is about, do you really need synthesis, right? Or do you just need some key numbers, right? Because you might have a huge set of data, right? But if you can distill what you need to know down to like a few key metrics, then you can just do that. And you can have like a pivot table or use Tableau or something like that, right? You just say, oh, here's the key metrics, and that's all I need to know. But the problem comes when you have lots of things that are going on, and you really need to figure out like what's the most important thing that's happening, and also what's the context of that, right? Is this number is it trending up or down? Is it this region was down 5% this month, but were all the regions overall down 8%, right? So it actually was doing better, right? Like all these little things that a human analyst, if they were looking at your data, would surface and put into a report. Those are the types of things that we could do. But again, you need to have almost, again, like too much information, right? Where you need to have it distilled down. And that doesn't cover all the situations, right? So and especially with when you add the scale aspect too, right? So you need this to be, maybe happening every week or every day or something, right? Where you have enough changes going on that it provides the scale and the need for this synthesis. So that's kind of, it is a subset for sure of the data analysis market, and we definitely cannot, it doesn't make sense to use our technology for a lot of data analysis tasks.
Gotcha. So, kind of a sort of fun last thought on this. Can this scale? I mean, if you're working with somebody like CBS Sports, can this scale to the level of like, could CBS Sports get in the business of, covering high school games, of getting into like, can you expand? Because if we think about the decline of the local paper, right, and you could see that this might be a way of providing that information out. Does that kind of modeling make sense?
Yeah, the answer is yes, and in fact, I mean, we've worked with MaxPreps in the past. That's the largest high school sports website in the country. And so, if anybody from MaxPreps is listening to this, like, let's get it going. Come on, guys! Like, we're actually like right, literally in the middle of talking with them, trying to get back to working with them because we kind of got shut down during COVID, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, the scale. I mean, we do fantasy sports just as an example for CBS, and the scale there is even much bigger than high school sports. For fantasy sports, and we're producing literally millions of unique pieces of content every single week. So the scale side of things, the bad news is you need it. The good news is it's almost limitless in terms of like, hey, I want to, if you're an organization, you say, we're sending out this sort of form letter to all of our customers or potential customers. Would it be better if we could send them something that's completely unique to them, right? And speaking to their data and their concerns. That's where this system can come into play. And yeah, it doesn't matter if you have 1 million customers or potential customers and you want something unique for every single one of them, then that's completely feasible. And that's the type of stuff that this technology opens up.
Well, that's a great place to end on. Steve, this has been super fascinating. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Dave, thanks so much for having me.
Are you struggling to hire top talent for your MSP? What if a team of senior technicians screened thousands of remote MSP candidates so you could review the best of them on video, only interviewing candidates you already like? Support Adventure handles your recruiting, HR, and onboarding needs, hiring only the best English-speaking talent from around the world. Make a remote team that works hard for you and fits your company's culture. Check out supportadventure.com/MSP Radio to learn more. Thanks for your time and attention. Time is a finite resource, and I really value you giving me some of yours. If you like this video, you can let me know with a like of the video, and even more valuable, hitting the subscription button. My content is all free, and I use metrics like subscriptions to pay the bills, so it has real value. The content here is produced under ethics guidelines posted at businessof.tech. If you're interested in more content like this, you can get access to content early via our Patreon at patreon.com/MSPradio. It's our give what you want model where you set the value of what you think the content is worth. If you like this podcast, you can catch it daily as the 5-minute news and commentary show, The Business of Tech, available on all your favorite podcatchers with links at businessof.tech. Just hit that big blue button to subscribe. Again, thank you for taking time out of your day to listen, and I really value the interaction. If you want to say something in the comments, I do respond and watch all that, and I look forward to talking to you next time.